Hello, in this video I'm giving a breakdown of how this illustration, this Gandalf illustration, was technically created. When I first got started in digital illustration, working in Photoshop, I spent a lot of time on YouTube watching how other people go through the process, but nobody ever really walked through and broke down the layers that they used and why. And since this is fairly simple with the number of layers that I have, I'm just going to step through each one and show how I came to the final result using the layers over here. And I'm going to try not to be too technical. Some familiarity with Photoshop is pretty necessary to understanding the process, since I'm not going to start from the ground up, but I do at least want to show how I came to this result using my layers. Everybody's process is a little bit different, so accumulate as many as you can, but having it laid out plainly can be really helpful. So this is the illustration I have. You notice it's very high texture, very penciled. One problem with digital art in general is that it has no texture to it inherently, like if you're working on paper, so you have to inject a little bit into it. So from the ground up I knew that this is what I wanted, and I approached it in a variety of ways to help get that result. I'm going to start off just by showing I did work from a reference photo on this, as I do with anything that's really realistic. I want to have a reference photo to it. I used actually a screenshot, which I can show here, and it's low resolution. I actually like to work from bad photos because if I'm enhancing, if I'm doing an illustration from a really good photo, there's not nearly as much point to it. But if I'm taking something like this, like a shot from the movie where it's really blurry, if I zoom in you can see how incredibly pixelated it is, there's no real detail, then I'm doing something that's a little bit more original, and also it gives me some flexibility to make decisions. It doesn't give me all the information. I have to guess a little bit. So I like this kind of reference for it. I did try to maintain the expression is really what I wanted. I wanted to maintain that expression. So what I do with this when I find an image that I want to work from is I take it and I put a grid over it, and you can see right here, this is my gridded image. I do not trace. Tracing is not as effective as you think it would be. Even though it is really tempting for people starting out in digital illustration, they assume, well, I'll just trace over it and it'll look good. It actually usually comes out stiff. It doesn't work very well. So if you're trying to get something down to the detail, doing a grid like this is a much better way to do it, and this is pretty commonly accepted practice. But I don't really approve of tracing in general. So what I did was I take this image, this gridded image, I fit it to the size I want, which is this is essentially an 11 by 17 sheet in landscape. It basically turns sideways. And I run it at 400 pixels per inch for this because I didn't need too much detail. 400 pixels is more than enough. And I move that image to my second monitor, which you can't see, and I work from that. And then what I do is I lay out the grid, if I can find my grid, here it is, on the actual page. And you'll notice I put crisscross on any area based on that photo that I took that's going to have excessive detail to just really help me get the detail down. Again, this is actually a tighter grid than you would typically use, but I really wanted to get the expression right, so that's why all the different little hatches to give me a good idea of exactly where each wrinkle, each line is placed. What goes into that first thing is, for one thing, at the very bottom of my layers palette you can see I always work on a grayscale background because it's like mid-tone paper, if you've ever worked on that with charcoal. It gives you the opportunity to go dark and also go light, and saves you a little bit of work because you're not constantly filling in. If you're working on white paper, you've got to fill everything into a mid-tone. This is just easier. So working on a mid-tone gray is better, and I go in with my initial pencil. This is breaking down the structure. Again, based on the grid, based on the reference photo, I'm just trying to lay out the composition of it. So I take usually a colored pencil, so that's kind of my indicator to know this is first sketch. And since my grid was blue, I went with a red pencil. So usually it's vice versa. And break it down. You notice it doesn't really look like him at this point. Without the value, it just doesn't do the trick. But it does do a decent job of telling me where things begin and where they end. So from that, I then move on to a basic pencil, which I'll pull that up here. I'm going to turn off the grid. First pencils look something like this. You also notice these weird little lines that run through. like this. That was actually because I was using a custom brush that apparently repeats in a pattern, so I stopped using it after I saw what it was doing. But since this doesn't actually show in the final piece, these pencils don't, it wasn't really that important. But basically this part was just going in and doing a better job of developing the face. I got the basic structure from the initial sketch from this one, and then I'm going to go in with the pencils and just improve upon it, just layer after layer. From there, it's time to lay in the basic value, which you can see I'm showing you images of the process right now, but my original pencil and then my original value, those are the layers there that I'm working on here. So laying in basic value, just taking a paintbrush and saying these are my dark areas, these are my lighter areas, and getting it rather simply broken down. I'm going to walk you through the actual layers now. So what we have at this stage is the gray background, the pencils on top, and then the actual value layer. So what I have at this stage looks something like this. I'm going to knock off the pencil layer since I don't need it anymore. And this is what my final sketch looked like after I went in with my brushes. I painted in, I blended, and then I took pencils and highlighted and did all the hair. The hair took an enormously long amount of time. It was definitely the most time-consuming part of this entire illustration. That was my fault for choosing someone who had so much hair and a giant beard. But these are my two basic layers, and this value I just keep painting on the same layer. Some people stack layers on top. I prefer to keep working on the same layer just like I'm actually painting on a canvas. It makes you a little bit more conscious of your mistakes and keeps the layer palette simpler, which is one reason why I'm even willing to show you this. But the meat of the layers actually doesn't happen for a while. Those are effects that go on top, color, things like that. In the beginning, it's all just straight up drawing, and it's done in grayscale in the beginning because I'm going to use blending modes and colors on top of it. Kind of like if you're working in pencil and then you watercolor over the top or use acrylic paints. This is probably just a little bit more efficient. So I put in all the value here, and then I also had this other layer down here at the bottom. I put it below the value so I wouldn't have to erase anything out, but it's the highlight hair. It's that bit of highlight that comes around the edges, so it's very light. That's the only part of the value that's really a separate layer. Now at this point I was pretty much done with Gandalf himself. What comes after that is building up on the color, and that's where the complexity of these come in. For one thing, I wanted a darker background, so I put in a solid color and I masked out everything that had Gandalf in it to make sure it didn't interfere, since sometimes there's some gaps and things like that. Since I use a mid-tone background, you can see if I turn it off there's some gaps. So I mask out everything behind Gandalf so we don't run into that problem. And then I start putting in these little blooms of light behind him. These are done also masking out behind Gandalf, and they are done with the gradient tool over here on the side. I just open a new layer and do that. I did one, I felt like it wasn't strong enough, so I duplicated it for another one to get even more bloom behind him. So you can see the difference there if I toggle it off and on. And then I, on top of that, did kind of an overall tint. It only really covers Gandalf, again masking out part of it using the mask attached to the side of it, but that's what this layer is here. Tint just kind of gives everything warmth underneath. You do this a lot in, I do it at least for under sketches for actual paintings, when you use something like a dark umber rather than black, just to give everything a little bit of natural warmth and color to it. Then in the background I did a clipped solid color to these background light layers to turn that blue. So now I've got some blue behind it, gives some good contrast against the warm light. My idea here was that he was kind of sitting near a fire, and then the moonlight or something coming in from behind, mixing those two. The next thing would be the skin color, which if I turn that on you get a dramatic difference. The skin color only actually covers the skin. I just let the tint take care of the beard for me. So if I throw that on there, oh, it also covers the pipe, I guess. So you get that difference there. The skin color actually comes in two layers. I did this one, and it's set to soft light. If I put it above the value and then set the blending mode to soft light, that's how I get this nice effect. And you'll notice also that the opacity of the layer, it's not fully opaque, it's a little bit transparent. If I bump it all the way up, it gets a little too intense. So I usually keep it down, I think I had it around 65. The next part of it was the warm light layer, which throws in a little bit of extra shadow, warms it up, and you notice it also changes the dynamic of his face a lot, as well as the beard. So again, assuming that there's a light source coming from the viewer's right over here, I wanted to make that part warmer and give something more dynamic to the shadows. Also, this one is also set to soft light, and the opacity of it is at 45%. If I bump it up, it's really intense. It looked a little too reminiscent of the Hobbit movie rather than the Lord of the Rings, so I dropped that down a lot to about 45%. Nice subtle effect. Usually less is more. Another element that I wanted to throw in after I was looking this over was it seemed a little bright down here at the bottom, so I threw in some darker shadows down below. So if I toggle that, you can see it just covers down here, and that layer, which is above all of the color, is set to multiply, which darkens it down, and at 81% opacity. Again, if I bump it up all the way, it's just a little too dark. So I usually end up pulling these down a little bit. So that's the basic color elements to it. You can see that everything's in place, but you can also see it still looks kind of digital. It doesn't really look, especially in the background, you can see it's way too clean. I want it to look a bit more like it's done on paper, or that it has some paint elements to it. So that's where photo textures come in handy. I actually downloaded one that was called Metal Scratches. You can find tons of royalty-free elements, textures to put into things. It's no problem on Google Images. Just make sure that it is indeed royalty-free. And if I throw that in, it textures over the background. Now you'll notice in the layers palette I put it below the value. I put it below Gandalf, basically. I only want this to affect the background. And to some they may think, well, this is cheating, shouldn't you do that by hand? But if you're working traditionally on paper, this is done automatically. See, we're actually having to compensate a little bit because digital is too clean. So find a texture, put it in there. I wanted some scratches, some metal scratches that go along with this idea of the pencil strokes. I wanted it to match, have some unity and harmony with that. So that's the element on top. And then I added one more as well, which is a paper texture, and this goes over everything. The background scratches are below Gandalf. The paper texture is above everything. If I turn it on, you can see it gives a good amount of texture to the skin, which is really where I want it. The skin has a lot of pores, so if you don't have any texture to it, it doesn't look quite right. That's why digital paintings sometimes look a little rough when it comes to skin. Well, actually, they look the opposite of rough. They look like plastic. So these are the two textures that I use. And this one, the background scratches, is set to soft light at 61%. The paper texture is set to overlay at 13%. If I bump it up, yeah, you don't want to see that. Texture is something that has to be a very light touch, because it doesn't take much to completely change the image. Very subtle effects. As far as choosing a blending mode for them, I just scroll through and try as many as I can, and whatever looks best, that's what I use. Just use a little bit of judgment and it's no problem. The next thing that I did was, and this is actually a smoke photo that's in the background. This is probably my biggest cheating thing, is I took a smoke photo, which again, easy to find, tons of them, royalty free, and I put that in at a really low opacity in its screen, which drops out the black. If I set it to normal and bump it up, you can see it's an actual image. So again, drop it down, set it to screen to drop out the black, and then I put pencil lines over the top to sharpen it up and bring some of it forward. I really felt like it needed the glow from the photo in the background, but the pencil lines were really what I wanted to stand out. I did notice one problem with it though. The smoke lines are here above it. You can see these are just pencil strokes, and it comes over here a little bit close to his hair, and it looks like his hair, so it's giving me a little bit of a problem in that respect. It might actually be worth knocking out a little bit of that so we have less interference between the two. But that could have been handled a little bit better. Maybe if I was less lazy, I'd break out a paintbrush and actually give it some glow behind it. It honestly wouldn't be that difficult, which is why I didn't put that much thought into it. But those are the big elements. So at this point we have the entire thing put together, actually a little bit better now that I took some of the smoke lines out. And this is what the final result looks like with just these basic layers. The breakdown is really just value over a dark background, and then color placed on top using blending modes. And that's the basic elements of it. I am going to mention the brushes that I'm using. I searched and downloaded custom brushes. These are, again, easy to find. People love to upload them, give you full license to use them. Wish I could remember what these are called, but these are pencil brushes that are created by users. So rather than the really clean basic Photoshop brushes that you get, which are going to give you these clean lines, instead I'm going to use a pencil brush that's going to give me rough lines. And that makes a big difference when it comes to giving a realistic look, because I love the look of pencil, and I don't want to lose that just because I'm working digitally. So I'm going to find brushes that do that. So that was the main brush that was used for the whole thing, but you also may remember when I was laying in basic value, there's obviously some painting happening. And for that I used a different set that I found that has, I think these are supposed to be pencils, but they work really well as paint brushes. This is a big image and I'm using a big brush, so it's moving kind of slow, but you notice it stacks. Like, I can see through a single stroke, but as I build up on it I can see less and less. That's what a good paintbrush does. And it also has rough edges and a little bit of texture to it. It's almost as though the brush hairs are moving outside the edges. I just can't lean too heavily on these, because as you start painting, the little jagged edges, they all look the same on each stroke, so you have to be careful that they don't, I mean, you can really see it here. The ends of each of these all look the same, and that can crop up and be noticeable if you're not careful. So something to look out for if you're using brushes. Switching between several or just not depending too heavily on them will help a lot with that. But those are the basic brushes I used, and then for things like the color in the soft light, the warm light coming on the side of his face, I just used basic Photoshop brushes. Soft brush and hard brush. Using one of those two, you can color really well, especially if your black and white imagery already has good texture. You don't have to worry about keeping texture with the way that you're coloring. So that's why I build it up from the bottom with texture, and then I come in on top and I'm not going to worry about texturing the color. Instead, I'll let everything else take care of that, and I'll end up with an image that looks a little bit more traditional than most digital work that I've done.